What's up, everybody? This is the Hedge Mage, and welcome back to another video and another Friday Night Magic report. This week at Friday Night Magic, I decided to play an old deck of mine that I honestly haven't played at an event in a while, and was very curious to see how the deck would do with the current metagame very much being dominated by things like Kuldotha Red and all that glitters piles. Ultimately, I was rather pleased with the deck's performance this week. So we're going to get into it. We're going to take a look at exactly what I brought in both the main board and the sideboard, as well as giving a brief overview of exactly how each matchup went. But before we get any further, if you would like to support the channel, if you could leave a like on this video and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate that. And with that said, let's get into it. Alright guys, and the deck we brought this week was Orzhov Ephemerate. Now, I have done an episode of what I play as well as a sideboard guide for this deck, so I'll have a link up there at the top of the screen for that if you want to check those out. I have made some small changes right before coming to this event. Very small, but mostly the deck is the same. But we do go into a little bit more detail on how, why I've made the certain card choices, and as well as like how I sideboard, what I take in and out. So that sounds interesting to you. Link will be up there. All right, and so let's get into it. Let's take a look what I have in my creatures here. I got 4 copies of Thraven Inspector. Uh Definitely been a staple of the format. It's just really good. Making a clue token is just being able to draw an extra card is great. Now we even have a functional reprint of this card, so we could probably go up to 8 inspectors. I've also thought about doing an even split of these. Right now, I'm just on the 4. I kind of like some other cards in the deck since sometimes I don't want to have to wait to spend a mana to draw a card, so I'm just running 4 right now. And speaking of that, we also got 4 copies of Spirited Companion, which is one of my favorite targets for Ephemerate. Definitely gotta play around removal a little bit so they don't kill this creature before you get Ephemerate to resolve, but if you can, that's basically an extra 2 cards that you can draw before your draw step, especially if you do it on your opponent's end step there. But yeah, very good card, lets you draw a bunch of your deck. And then we also got 2 copies of Dawnbringer Cleric, just a very good card in the current meta game. All of its modes are really relevant. I mean, gaining 2 life against the red decks can really mean life or death. Also, being able to blow up an all that glitters is really, really important right now. It seems like any deck in white that can play all that glitters in a bunch of artifacts, throw, your at minimum 12 artifact lands, and all of a sudden you have a good deck. Kind of got some feelings about that, but that is where we are at in the format right now. So we've got to have our enchantment hate wherever we can get it, and just mainboarding a couple pieces of that will definitely help you win game 1 against them. Okay, and then we also got 4 copies of Inspiring Overseer, another great card draw spell. This is also a really good target for Ephemerate, as it also lets you gain a life. So we do have a lot of life gain in the deck, and I do think with how good red decks are in this format, gaining life wherever you can is really, really important. All right, and also we got 2 copies of Thorn of the Black Rose. Now, drawing an extra card every turn in this deck is very, very pivotal. We are a grindy mid-range control type of deck, so maintaining card advantage throughout the game is really what's gonna make it or break it for you. And often with our board state here, with 2 or 3 toughness creatures on the field, it's really easy to set up a board state where your opponent doesn't really have a very good attack, so you can maintain things like the Monarch and things like the Initiative pretty easily with this deck. We also have a ton of removal, which we'll be getting into soon. Also, we're running 3 copies of Goliath Paladin. Speaking of the Initiative is just a really, really good mechanic. It gets so much value on it, no matter which way you go. If you want to steamroll yourself into the trap room and have your opponent lose 5 life, that's always very good. But if you want to go to the other side and scry to get a treasure token and an extra creature, those are also really good good ways to go about it. Really depends on the context of where the game is going. But yeah, sometimes I go in either direction, but the initiative is very, very powerful. All right, and then 3 copies of Vampire Sovereign. Now, I have basically won games by ephemerating Vampire Sovereign. Just draining 3 is very, very powerful. This is one of the few decks where you will see 5 mana spells. So we are, we we play bigger stuff in this deck than a lot of popper decks seem to curve out around 2, maybe 3. But here we can go up to five mana spells. We do have a lot of card draw. Not really much, really any ramp, but you will draw into enough lands to curve out and play these, usually by turn 5 or 6. So Vampire Sovereign, really, really fun card, really great target for Ephemerate in the late game to just sort of just take a win out of nowhere. And then we also got 1 copy of Custodian Squire. Sometimes your opponent is also playing mid-range and you need your creatures back. So this is great. Also can be ephemerated since it's an enter the battlefield ability. All right, so now we're going to get into our instants and sorceries. So first, I got 4 copies of Cast Down. Kind of I would say, one of the best removal spells in the game. As we don't have non-legendary creatures, so it's basically going to hit everything. The only thing this is going to really struggle with is anything with, like, say, hexproof or indestructible. Obviously, there's animated lands that can be troublesome. Also, the Bogles. You don't see Bogles as much anymore, but not a great card against them as all their creatures have hexproof. Also, the indestructible lands. Can't really deal with that, but we got other ways to deal with those. Also got 4 copies of our namesake card, Ephemerate. So this card just basically, we've built this deck to use Ephemerate to its fullest. So we have a ton of enter the battlefield effects. So we get a lot of value out of our creatures with Ephemerate. And then we also have 3 copies of Chainer's Edict. So there was a thought for a while that I might switch to Tithing Blade, as that is a new edict effect, though with how often we see, you know, at least 7 to 10 lands on the battlefield, because the games do go very long with this deck. Uh, Being able to get a second edict effect out of previously played Chainer's Edict by playing it for its flashback costs has come up a lot, so which is why I have not switched over to Tithing Blade, so I'm still on my Chainer's Edicts. And then to go against Kuldotha, I am mainboarding 3 copies of Suffocating Fumes because an instant speed sweeper is really, really good against them and probably one of your best options in terms of how you're going to fight against them. And you have to be able to hit them at instant speed because they're going to basically drop a bunch of creatures, give them all +1/+0 and haste, and they're going to swing at you for probably 10 damage, and it's really hard to come back from that, especially because at that point, they've already probably hit you for a little bit, and then you just die to a couple chain lightnings or lightning bolts, even if you did board wipe them after that happens. So taking all that damage to the face is really, really, really tough to walk away from. And then we also got 2 copies of Unmake. So this hits a lot of stuff. I mean, you can hit an indestructible land. It is also just a good 3 mana removal spell. All right, and that is the main deck. And we are on a 21 land build. So in the mana base, I got 1 copy of Obscure Storefront. This helps you gain it. You do gain a life from this. You also can grab a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. So it helps with your color fixing. We do have some cards that have either 2 white or 2 black pips in their mana cost. So making sure you have the right lands out is rather important. We also got 4 copies of Scoured Barrens. This is a gain land, so yeah, we need to be gaining a bunch of life because we are a little bit slower than some of the faster decks like Kuldotha again, and them being a red deck, you need to gain some life. All right, and then we also got 3 copies of Orzhov Basilica. Now we do have a bunch of lands here that have ETB effects, so being able to get more value out of them with our bounce lands is pretty great. So, speaking of ETB effects, we got two copies of Bojuka Bog to fight against Tolarian Terrors, as that is another deck that gets very out of hand very, very quickly, so you want to be prepared for that. And then one copy of Radiant Fountain, another piece of tech against the red decks. This lets you gain 2 life. I believe, I can't remember, I think it's Kabir Crossroads. I was running that for a while. I decided to switch over to Radiant Fountain as it is an untapped land, and sometimes I can't really be counting on a tapped land. It's just, I need that untapped land. We don't have a ton in the deck since we have a ton of tap lands with all of our Scour Barrens and our Basilicas, Bajuka Bogs, etc. Also got two copies of Ash Barrens to help fix our mana once more. And then we got one swamp, and the rest we just have basic plains. And that's the main deck. So in our sideboard, what I currently have is we have two copies of Drown in Sorrow, just a great um, board wipe. I was previously on Arms of Hadar, but the Scry one and the fact that we can do it a turn early is pretty good, especially with decks that go wide like Kuldotha. We kind of want to be able to do it a turn early. Waiting till turn 4, and especially if our fourth land drop is a tap land, we're not really board wiping them to turn 5 with Arms of Hadar. That's just not cutting it right now. This does kill our creatures as well, which is not ideal, but the fact that we can do this on turn 3 makes it a much better choice right now. At least that's what I'm thinking. Then we also got one more copy of Chainer's Edict if we are going against, more Tolarian Terror decks or Bogles or what have you, or just decks that are attacking with single creatures like maybe mono white heroic. Chainer's Edict is a great card to bring in against them, and one more copy of Dawnbringer Cleric. As Glitters is out there, Burn is out there, so we need some more tech against them. And here's another thing that I've been trying out against Burn, which is Union of the Third Path. So this lets us draw a card, and then we gain life equal to the number of cards in our hands. And with this deck, you usually have a pretty full hand. So this card could easily, for 3 mana, draw you a card and gain you 6 or 7 life or more. Sometimes I have a problem with how many cards I have in my hand. That happens a lot in this deck just with all the card draw you have through ephemerating Spirited Companions and Inspiring Overseers. Also, you also have some card draw with the initiative. So, yeah, so this can definitely gain you a bunch of life, also draw you an extra card. And then we got 4 copies of Nihil Spellbomb because we need to fight all the decks that play out of the graveyard, specifically Tolarian Terror, though you're also going to want to bring this in against Mogwarts and Familiars and other decks that, maybe have some type of thing in their graveyard that you care about. Turbo Fog, for example. And then we got one copy of Duress. Now, this is a new inclusion in the deck, or in the sideboard, which I didn't think I had in my previous videos about the deck. But I've been bringing this in since I have been seeing a lot more grindier, mid-range, or just tempo decks in my local meta. So bringing in a Duress to get rid of their interaction has been pretty nice. And then we also got one copy of Patrician Scorn. If you cast Ephemerate, you can then just play this card for free and get rid of all the enchantments on the battlefield. So it really helps against a couple different decks, both Bogles and all the Glitters piles. And it's also an instant which we love. And then going up against any type of affinity, we got 3 copies of Dust to Dust. Now, I would say if you are running things like Dust to Dust in your sideboard, the minimum you're going to want is 3. So we have our 3 here. I think right now with exactly how many different all the glitters piles are happening. You have Orzhov, you have Boros, you have Azorius, you have Esper. So there are just so many flavors of all the glitters right now and affinity that I think even running 4 is probably a pretty good idea. Right now, I am just on 3, though, and then we also got one copy of Mana Tithe, which is kind of one of my secret pieces of interaction in the deck that a lot of people don't see coming. I have definitely won games just by a well-placed mana tithe, which I love it. No one ever sees it coming, and it's kind of a pet card of mine, but I am running one of in the sideboard. And that's the deck. So, let's talk about the matchups. So, match one, I win up against Mono Blue Terror. Mono Blue Terror, this is a great matchup for us, honestly. Though I would say Demir is a little bit better because they don't generally have as many counter spells. Mono Blue Terror definitely can run more. So I knew I had to play around those, but we did win that game in two. So we won the first game after sideboarding. I brought in I think I brought in Duress and maybe a Chainer's Edict. I don't think and all the spell bombs, obviously, but I we had no problem winning that game. They were very long, grindy games as we saw a lot of counter spells, and we had kind of had to play around that, and as well as trying to remove all their Cryptic Serpents when their Cryptic Serpents came down. Tolarian Terror is definitely something hard to deal with, though we did have things like Chainer's Edict. The biggest problem of going against that deck is honestly, Delver of Secrets. Delver can basically take your Monarch from you. It can take the initiative from you, so that card can definitely be a problem. However, my opponent did hit the sort of RNG with the Delver and had a hard time transforming it as their top card just kept being lands instead of instants and sorceries, which is kind of the downside with Delver, but still it was a very fun match and we got that one in two. So my second match was against Kuldotha Red. This one was definitely a pretty tough one as this, I would say, Ephemerate was a much more favorable against Kuldotha Red back in the Swift Spear days because they didn't have as many creatures. Sure, they did go wide from time to time, though at this stage in the game, they are definitely going wider with a big swarm of creatures more than they used to. And they were a lot more spell heavy back when Swift Spear was around. So now that Swift Spear's gone, the deck has kind of changed its plan and is definitely having more of a swarmy go wide strategy, which can be pretty tough to deal with. Especially they can get going pretty early, so you really have to have a board wipe ready when you're playing a slower deck like Ephemerate. So I think we lost the first game against them, and they just beat us down pretty quickly. Game two, I did have some very well placed board wipes at the proper times and hit a lot of removal spells. So I got them to a point where they started fizzling out. We started gaining a bunch of life. We were above 10 and they were just in a top deck situation. So my opponent then scooped the game. We went to game three and it was very, very close. I saw about maybe three or four Tomb Raiders come out, and those things really, really hit you pretty good. I did have a well placed board wipe, but I was at 5 life right after I think I played a Drown in Sorrow and cleaned up the board. Um, but right after that, they hit me with two Galvanic Blasts, which he didn't have Metalcraft at the time, but so he shocked me twice with two galvanic blasts, and then sacrificed implement of combustion for the remaining damage, and so it was just a perfect 5 damage right. Exactly when he needed it. So he did win that match. We did play 3 games. It was a ton of fun. Very, very close match. So definitely feels like Orzhov Ephemerate, though it is a decent match against Kuldotha Red. It's not nearly as good as it used to be, though also really depends on what your draws are like. In the situation where my opponent didn't have all that burn in their hand, we could have possibly stabilized and maybe won that final game. Though getting down to 5 life like that, it's gonna be pretty tough when they cast a couple like a lightning bolt and then hit you with the fire blast. So that deck definitely has a lot of ways to just get win the game even after they've been board wiped, so it can be pretty tough. All right, in the final match, I played against mono black rat, so definitely a bit of a rogue deck there. You don't really see people playing like a rat tribal deck these days, but this person was, so I really admire their tenacity. It was a pretty favorable match for us. We won that match in two, as I just have so much removal, and all of my board wipes hit their creatures. So I don't even think I sideboarded a lot of stuff against them. Mostly, I think I sideboarded in more board wipes. So I brought in my two Drown and Sorrows, and it was. I honestly felt a little bad about how brutal it was because basically they're playing a fair deck that plays smaller creatures. Our deck is very favorable against any deck that wants to play that kind of game. They're also not as fast as a lot of the other aggro decks, like like we just talked about Kuldotha, which is a very fast aggro deck. It was kind of one-sided. I mean, it basically just killed all their creatures, became the monarch, took the initiative, and the rest was just the game. So I did feel a little bit bad for the player as no one really wants to be playing a fair like creature based deck and go up against a very well tuned mid range or control deck, which is kind of like the worst matchup for them. But ultimately, it was a fun game. They were a really great sport about it, and it was always a good time to go to the game store and turn cards sideways. And that's going to do it for today's video, everyone. Thank you again for anyone who stuck around to the end. Definitely would love to hear what you guys think about playing Orzhov Ephemerate. Is this a deck that you have been playing or sort of abandoned? Is it something you're still interested in checking out? Personally, I think it is a very fun deck to play and to pilot, and definitely still has some very good matchups within the current metagame. But yeah, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. As always, I hope you all are having a wonderful day, and I will see you all next time.